Hi! Today we're going to be doing a digital scrapbooking texture tutorial. I'm going to show you how to take your pre-made overlays and turn them into texture plates that will give your digital papers just a ton of dimension and texture and just make them lovely. So I'm starting with an overlay that I've made that is a coarse fabric weave. Fabrics are great for making papers because real traditional scrapbooking papers often have a fabric texture to them, so when you use them in your digital designs, it really makes them look very realistic. So the first thing that I'm going to do is duplicate my original. This is a rule of thumb for any graphic designing that you do. Never work on your original. The reason for that is because it is so easy to accidentally save over that file and just lose it forever. So we're going to duplicate this by going to Image and Duplicate. And there's our copy. Now normally I would close out my original so that I was in no danger of hurting it in any way, but I actually want to use it later, so I'm just going to minimize it and put it out of the way on my workspace where I'm not going to be touching it, but that I can easily get to it. So here is our copy file. Now if this wasn't already a grayscale image, the first thing that you would want to do is turn it into a grayscale image by going to Image, Adjustments, Desaturate. Desaturate isn't always the best way to make a black and white image, but for our purposes it will work just fine for this overlay. Mine is already a grayscale image, so I don't need to do that step. The next thing that I'm going to do is change the levels on this. For my texture plate, I want it to have a high contrast so that the texture really shows up. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. And then I'm just going to grab the white slider and move it down, and the black slider, move it up, until I have a really high contrast on my overlay. And once you have it to a place that you like, just click OK, and there we go. Now, when we make our texture plate, Photoshop is going to read the black areas on our image as raised portions, and the white would be recessed. Now, if you look at my overlay here, what is white is actually what I want to be raised, because that's the fabric or the threads in the weave, and in a piece of fabric those would be raised up and on top. So in order to let Photoshop see my overlay correctly, I'm going to want to turn it into a negative image. And now, when you're using this technique on your overlays, you can zoom in and look and see what portions you want to be raised up. And if they're already white, you don't need to make a negative. But if those images that should be raised are white, they need to be black, then you need to make that negative. So I'm going to do this by going to Image, Adjustments, and Invert. That's also Control I on your keyboard. So now we can see that the black portions are my threads, and so those will be raised on that texture plate. So now we're all ready to make our texture plate. And this is so simple. We go to Filter, Stylize, and Emboss. Now for the lighting angle on your texture plate, you should match that up to whatever angle you're using for the rest of the designs in your kit. If you have changed that angle from the program default, which is 120, then all of your lighting should be the same on all of your different elements. The reason for this is that when people go to use your scrap kit, if you have the lighting coming from 120 on your papers and then from a different angle, say 3940 on a brad or a flower, it's going to look off. The person who's using the kit might not know what it is that's not right with your kit, but it's going to catch their eye in a way that just makes it look wrong. So always try to keep your lighting angles consistent. Now, I like 120. Most people use the default. It's a good angle, gives you a really good look. So I'm leaving it at the default for my texture plate. Now, for the height and amount, you can really play with these and see what you like. Usually for height, less is more. 1 or 2 is a good setting. Usually 3 starts getting to be a bit harsh. I'm going to set it at 1 for my fabric weave here. And then the amount, anywhere between 1 and 300 is usually a good amount. If you go under that, you're starting to lose a lot of that dimension. It gets a little bit too flat. Over 300, it starts looking very harsh and pixelated. So I'm going to go around 200 for my weave here. And once you have it set where you like it, just click OK. And there we have our texture plate. Doesn't that look great? What really looks great though is when you add it to a paper. So I'm going to open up a new document, my default paper size for scrapbooking, and I'm just going to flood fill it with a color here. Now I'm going to grab my texture plate and just grab this layer and hold down my shift key while I drag it into my new document. And then I'm going to change the blending mode on this texture plate to soft light. Now when I zoom into my paper, look at that. That adds so much dimension to my paper. But to really make it pop and look like real fabric, I'm going to come back here to my original overlay. And I'm going to drag this in over my paper onto the top layer and change the blending mode on this one to soft light as well. Now here's where the fun really starts. If I change the opacity on this layer so that more of that texture comes through, and bump down the opacity on this one as well, you get the color variations that are in that overlay along with the dimension of the texture plate, and it just looks great. And now to show you a comparative, most people would use the overlays without the texture added in, and that's what that looks like. It's just kind of flat, it's not very sharp. When you add the texture plate in, it just adds so much crispness, texture, dimension. It just looks gorgeous. And from here you can add all sorts of designs, other overlays, even more texture if you want. So there's your lesson on adding some rich, wonderful texture to your papers. Try it out, share what you've made, and have fun.